Francais in English by Salma, Alicia, Henry, and Othniel. English has gone through many transformations throughout its history. To study English, one must study its history. One of the most important changes in the history of English is the transition from Old English to Middle English. The change in the language from one stage to another were in fact brought upon the influence of another language, French. French influence on the English language started with the Normans. The Normans were originally Vikings who gained land in Normandy, France, in 700 CE, through the ruling of Charles the Simple. They originally spoke the Norman dialect of French. The English under this time were also under the attack from the Danes, a group of Vikings from Scandinavia. They united under Alfred the Great, who fought them back, regaining much of the expansive English territory the Danes had conquered. After many generations, Edward the Confessor died and promised the English throne to William, Duke of Normandy. This displeased the English nobility, and they elected their own king, King Harold of Wessex. William was angered and decided to get his throne the hard way. To William's advantage, the Danes had decided to attack the northern border right before William exhausting the English forces. William defeated the English and killed Harold of Wessex at the Battle of Hastings, which would later prove to be the last successful invasion of England. William, now dubbed the Conqueror, kept many of the governing techniques of the English, though he confiscated land from the former English nobility and gave much of it to his followers. This change meant that the royal court would now speak in French, meaning that all the nobility would speak in French as well.
French quickly became the language of high-class English society. As the Norman invaders began to take places in England's aristocratic system, so did the French language take its place in high class. Before long, French became the language of society and the aristocracy, as it was the language of the king and his nobles. Speaking French became a sign of your social and political standing. The rich who could not speak French hastened to learn for social gain, while the English middle and lower classes were stuck with their peasant language. English was now very diminished. It had once been the language of all Anglo-Saxon land, but now had little place in society. Latin was the language of the church and learning, while French was the language of status and aristocracy. English was now only a spoken language, as most of those who could write were of high social standing and only wrote in French, or, in religious circumstances, Latin. English soon became the language of the largely uneducated people, and lost most of the vocabulary for things to do with upper-class living, such as fashion, court, and government dealings. Its many dialects became so distinct that one was unrecognizable from the others. During this time, English lost 85% of its vocabulary, and the words lost are thought to be closer related to higher socio-economic status. In other words, the words most frequently used by the aristocracy. As the remaining English speakers had no use for those words, they simply went out of use.
Though English continued to be spoken in the lower classes, it was not exempt from major influence from the aristocratic French language the upper classes spoke. The peasants still spoke their Germanic language, Old English, but they eventually started borrowing words from the French. The French words most of them knew were limited to those needed in things that encompassed both classes, such as military, government, and general cuisine. They borrowed words so they could communicate more effectively with the elites, while others thought it was more fashionable to imitate them. French, in this case, overpowered English vocabulary use, as French was the official language of the land.
English went from being a strictly Germanic language to being a mix between Romance and Germanic languages. The simpler, more everyday words retained their German roots, while French had its influence mainly through new, more nuanced vocabulary. Words like calf and deer became veal and venison in the Anglo-Norman language. The Anglo-Norman words began to acknowledge the significance of the French language and became more dignified in its use of words. Although there was a change in words, the old world words were still kept and were used by the lower class farmers and such. Anglo-Norman was used for the elite aspects of society, like military, government, religion, law, leisure, art, and cuisine.
Despite all the challenges that English endured during the earlier years of the Norman conquest, it survived. English was well developed and deeply rooted in the people by the time the Normans conquered Anglo-Saxon territory, and it would have been a hard language to separate from the people. English, though not favored in the mainly Norman aristocracy, was nevertheless mainly used to rule over the English-speaking population. The presence of English in the commercially and socially prominent city of London also ensured English survival. The first flow to Anglo-Norman French occurred in 1204, when King John of Normandy lost their holdings in France. This started to sever the Normans from their predominantly French roots, as all their government land was now strictly English. Even those who still possessed land in France had to give it up when the King of France declared that no one could hold lands in both England and France. The Norman nobles now began to think of themselves as Englishmen, which increased Norman and English intermarriage, meaning that their children, who would eventually take their fathers' places, would possess some English roots. Many times, their children would grow up speaking both English and French, mixing some English grammar and style with French vocabulary. This was the start of French vocabulary being borrowed into the English language. The Hundred Years' War from 1337 to 1453 officially established French as the language of the enemy, and speaking in the formerly high-status French language made one appear both unpatriotic and snobbish. The Black Plague's presence in England in 1349 and 1350 also contributed to the prevalence of the English language within the population. The Black Death killed a third of the English population, including a disproportionate number of the Latin verse clergymen. As the peasantry and lower middle classes made up a larger part of the population by the end of the epidemic, the English-speaking people had a larger say. All these factors combined finally took the balance of French and English in England in English's favor. After 1350, it was just a matter of time before English overran French presence in Norman England. The Statute of Pleading in 1362 declared English the official language of courts and parliament, making French much less related to society and government. In 1386, English became the official language of instruction in schools. What pushed English even further was the period of great individual writers during the latter half of the 14th century. This is when the English language began to recirculate itself into writing, when it had spent centuries as a largely spoken language.
English resurfaced, particularly in writing. Around 20 to 25% of the written vocabulary appeared to be borrowed from French. Most of these words are related to government, law, and high-class social life. When English retreated to being the language of the lower classes, most of the vocabulary to do with high-class living would have been dropped. Therefore, when the French-speaking aristocracy started to rediscover English, they filled in the vocabulary gaps left with their already existing French words. In general, French words were either more nuisance than the simpler English terms, or referred to words to do with higher class living, which many no longer existed in England. The French would change words like cow to beef or swine to pork, depending on whether they were referring to the farm animal or the meat. The English took words like justice and attorney, and they took the French word gentle to form gentleman. The Normans changed the French sound quoi, which would sound like a K, to a wa. For example, the word question would be pronounced as question, and the French pronounced it question with a K. The French used the sound cha, while the Normans changed it to ka. So the Normans would say cattle, while the French would say chattel. Normans changed the French prefixes air and orar to art and ort. So Normans would say victory, while the French would say victoire. Also, the Anglo-Normans kept the letter S in words, the French took them out. So for forest, the French would say foray, though Normans also didn't follow the French dramatic word ordering.
While the Anglo-Normans borrowed words from the Norman French making up over 50% of all English words, they also borrowed grammar and other items of language. Another difference between these two languages is that the Norman letter C, initially pronounced like a K, began to be pronounced as an S, an example being that the word mice became mice. More changes made to the English language so that the Anglo-Normans borrowed the phonemes Z and V, and that shows that very is a Norman word. One last change to the language is that during that time, the sentence structure subject-verb-object emerged. Therefore, changes in language go beyond just words. The relationship between French and English started in 1066 when the Normans conquered Anglo-Saxon land. It was originally used by the elites of England, but its authority caused much of its vocabulary and grammar to bleed into the cracks of the remaining English language. The power dynamic between the English-speaking peasantry and the French-speaking aristocracy really helped to push French vocabulary and structure influence into English, especially in the areas to do with higher class living. To this day, using French terms or French-based words in English is considered sophisticated. The impact that French has had on English has proved to be most influential, transforming Old English to Middle English and playing a crucial part in English as we know it today.